Okay, so in this video, I'm going to go through exactly how I mastered Spanish pronunciation and exactly how you can do it too. If you don't know me, my name is Hamid, I'm 16 years old and I became a polyglot at just 13 years old after getting fluent in Spanish after the summer of 2022, where I studied for 120 hours total. Here's my before and after.
Hola, estoy comiendo comida
And this was directly after the summer.
para mejorar mi español cuando no tengo mucho tiempo libre para estudiar español.
Y pues por si ahora hablo con fluidez y puedo conversar con los nativos y bueno, hablar de lo que quiera. According to an AI analysis of my transformation, that means I saved around 200 to 250 hours compared to the average learner, according to an analysis of my level before and after. And I've also done this for other people, like for example my client Eduardo. This was his Spanish before.
Hola, me llamo Eddie. Yo tengo 15 años. Quiero.
And then here's one of the conversations that we had after.
Pues para mí
Sí.
me gusta jugar el Rocket League para aprender español, así que ya lo sé las palabras del Rocket League. Me gusta ir al gimnasio, ya lo sé las palabras y el gimnasio.
So as you can see, he was conversation fluent. We had a full conversation, and I'll have that video linked of his transformation. According to AI, he saved 200 to 350 hours. And so it's safe to say that when it comes to learning Spanish, there are certain ways to do it that is faster than others. And in this video, I'm going to go through one of those parts, which is accent, which is pronunciation. So we're going to go through 4 things, okay? And this is like the plan for getting the perfect Spanish accent. And this is exactly what I went through when I was learning Spanish, okay? So the first is Spanish versus real Spanish. That's like step 0, understanding this concept. Then we have the actual accent. So then we have vowels, key sounds and letters, and then the accent and stress, okay? And these range from the most important to the least important, okay? So the most important is Spanish versus real Spanish, then vowels, then key sounds and letters, then accent/stress. So when I was learning Spanish, I started with something called language transfer. And it was because I was doing research on the best ways to learn Spanish. And this guy in my class, and the reason why was because this guy in my class had made it like a trend to use Duolingo. And so I was jealous and I wanted to obviously find the best way to learn Spanish because he had gotten better grades than me in Spanish. And I was a nerd. I had really, really good grades. And so this, not that, bright student, he had like not very good grades, who had gotten better grades than me in Spanish, had been using Duolingo to study. And so I was like, no, I'm gonna try to compete with this guy almost. And so I started Duolingo, and then I eventually found language transfer. And that's where I first discovered how to get the perfect Spanish accent or pronunciation, okay? And so first, we're going to start with something called Spanish versus real Spanish, okay? Now, I go through these concepts all the time on my channel. You can watch any of my videos to find those out. We're going to talk about Spanish versus real Spanish. Now, when it comes to how most people learn Spanish, they do it through this conventional way, memorizing ABCs, flashcards, Duolingo, and it's this very like monotonous, well-known sort of way of learning Spanish, right? It's just very, okay, memorize the ABCs, then memorize the numbers, then learn how to go through different like topics in Spanish, and then after that memorize a few sentences, and then you get it. It's this very basic sort of structure that has been shoved down our throats. The problem with this is that we waste our time with this, and I've proven it to myself and others about how there is another way to get fluent, okay? And the concept here is that real world Spanish is different to what school has been teaching us, okay? Real world Spanish isn't the same as the Spanish that we've been learning in the regular sort of like conventional way that you've been finding online. Let me ask you a simple question. How do Spaniards actually speak Spanish? Think about that. I have an example on here, but we'll deviate a little, right? When we think about how native Spanish speakers speak, which is our goal is to be able to understand and speak with natives, right? How do natives speak? Think about that. Because a native doesn't say, hola, yo hablo español. A native says, hola, hablo español. Like that, like a very, hola, hablo español. A very fast sort of thing. A native would pronounce these words like, instead of saying escúchame, a native would say escúchame, right? Instead of saying aquí estoy, a native says aquí estoy, okay? And so there's a difference between Spanish, like the written Spanish, the aquí estoy. Pablo está comiendo mucha comida. Y Pablo, it's Spanish, yes, but it's Spanish in like the quotation marks because it's not real Spanish. It's not real world Spanish. Real world Spanish is that Pablo está comiendo comida y después. You get it? It's very different. It sounds the same, sort of, but it's very like, it's a very big difference when you think about it. And especially when you hear native speak and you add the speed and all that. And so here's where we get into what real Spanish is, okay? Real world Spanish has those three parts that we were talking about. And this is how you master Spanish pronunciation. So first is vowels. The base of native Spanish is vowels. If you don't get the vowels right, you simply cannot sound like you're from a Spanish-speaking country. You simply do not have correct pronunciation. Okay, so that's the first step. We're going to go for exactly how to do that though. Now, the second one on top of that are the letters and characters. And this is in relation to pronunciation, right? What's actually next step is speaking faster and then dropping letters and combining words. And this is in relation to letters and characters. We're going to get to that as well. And then finally, it's the accent, and also in certain words, there is something called stress or as well. And we're going to get to that as well. So just understand, this is what real Spanish is. Understand the difference between real Spanish and then Spanish. We are trying to master the pronunciation of real Spanish. That being said, if you don't care about pronunciation and accent, like a lot of us, there are some people, I'll tell you a story. I was doing coaching, so like last year, okay, as I was getting into teaching Spanish and I wanted to refine my skills before I created any program or anything. So now I have a program in the Speech Spanish Academy, it's in the description, and I teach people Spanish, right? That's how I taught like Eduardo, for example. But prior to then, I did coaching with people and I did it for free just so I could practice, right? And I had one client who was pretty old in his 50s. And we were going through the accent because this is the first part about Spanish. You want to go to a perfect accent, a perfect pronunciation. And we tried for like 2 weeks and we could not get any of the vowels right. He couldn't get the pronunciation right. But then at the end of these 2 weeks, I just asked him like, wait, do you even care about having a nice accent, like a pronunciation, like good pronunciation? And then he told me like, nah, I don't really care. I just want to speak Spanish. Okay. So the idea here is if you don't really care about speaking with a nice pronunciation and accent, you can skip it. But I will say this, when it comes to understanding natives, you can't skip this. And what happens is speaking and understanding, they sort of overlap where you'll speak in the way that you hear people speaking and you'll naturally want to hear people speaking the way that you speak, right? And so you won't be able to avoid real Spanish because it obviously exists within natives. And so instead of trying to avoid it, it's better to try to embrace it by actually learning it, okay? And so this is how we're going to learn it. So now that you understand real Spanish and the difference between Spanish and real Spanish, let's talk about vowels. So vowels are these sounds, okay? And now there are different linguistic ways for them. Just generally, even in English, okay? Vowels are these sounds that are like open mouth, you can think, okay? Think about sounds, letters basically, that are the bones of the sentences, okay? So think about this. Now, if a sentence didn't have these letters, you couldn't string them together. Think about every sentence in Spanish or in English, okay, even in English, right? If we took the sentence, hey, how are you? If you took away the A's, E's, I's, O's, and U's, you don't have a sentence anymore. It's just kind of like a continuous, like, HY, HW. So, hey, how? Let's say that, hey, how becomes hey, hey. Do you get it? It's not a sentence anymore. The thing with vowels is they're like the building blocks. They're like skeleton of sentences. And vowels is the key difference between how a native speaks and how non-native speak. So the first step is you have to be able to pronounce Spanish vowels. So the Spanish vowels are, the A's is A, E's are E, I's are I, O's are O, and U's are U. Okay, A, E, I, U, O. A good way to practice these is there's two ways to practice these, okay? The first way is simply just try imitating almost like these monkeyish sounds. You can hear a, e, I, u, o, okay? The thing with these vowels, and I don't see anyone else talking about this online, which is weird, these vowels actually make more sense. These vowels, the way they're pronounced, are actually the beginning part of how we pronounce them in English, okay? So think about that. Think about how we pronounce O, okay? O kind of has two parts in it. There's the O sound, and then there's the woo sound. O woo. O woo. Right? Spanish is just the first sound that comes out. You don't say O woo, you say O. That's it. O. Right? Hola. O, not hola. Do you hear that difference? Do you hear the difference between the gringo versus the Spanish person? Not hola, not hola, but o-a, hola. In fact, every single Spanish sentence can be simplified into just vowels. Think about ¿cómo estás? O-o-e-a. And you see how that's the structure, that's the bones of the sentence. It's the skeleton, so to speak. And so another way to get these down is to think that it's kind of like laughing, right? And this is another one. So you can say ha 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 ha, and then get rid of the H. Ah 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 ah. He 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 he. And then you get rid of the H. Eh. He. He. E. Do you get it? It's a very easy way to do that as well. Okay? Understand? So those are two ways to pronounce them. If you really struggle with pronouncing them, it's all about practice, right? Another way to think about it is just to sort of mock a Mexican or a native Spanish person, right? Think about like those comedians that sort of imitate the accent, right? Like maybe seen this thing on TikTok where they're like, "Oh, you want me to put on the stereotypical accent of the Indian or the Mexican?" And then the guy's like, "Oh, no, thank you." And then the other guy's like, "Oh, but it pays 100K." And then they start speaking Spanish with like a really stereotypical accent. It is true though. The stereotypical accent is the accent of the native. That's why it's a stereotype. It's not even a stereotype. It's just how they speak, right? So it's not hola, it's hola, o-a. And the harder and like better you get these vowels, the better your Spanish accent becomes, okay? The easiest way to get a perfect accent in Spanish is the vowels. That's it, right? It's not Spanish, it's Spanish, right? A-I. Like even in any other Spanish sentence, right? Let's say escúchame, right? It's not escúchame, it's e-u-a-e. Escúchame, right? It's not e-u-a-e, right? It's not that, it's escúchame. E-u-a-e. Do you get it? Do you see how the vowels change the entire sound of any word that you pronounce? Next is the letters and characters. So Spanish has certain strings of letters and characters and stuff that just like isn't the same. We'll start with the most common one and the most popular one is the rolling R's. I've never struggled with this, okay? Personally for me, okay, if you don't know me, I grew up speaking 3 languages. And so I only needed to learn 1 language to become a polyglot, which was really nice. And a lot of these vowels were similar to Swedish. You know, I was born and raised in Sweden. And so a lot of these weren't that hard for me. But the rolling R's was something that I never understood how people couldn't get this. However, I've realized that there is a method to getting it, okay? So the rolling R's is when there's double R's in Spanish. And what you do is you roll the R's, meaning you sort of vibrate the R's. Okay, that's how I like to think about it. Instead of r, you go rrr. This kind of sounds like a purr almost. Think about the word purr, right? There's double R's on purr. Purr. Almost think about how a cat purrs. That's kind of a good way to think about it, right? Some people are really good at this kind of stuff. Others may be way worse at it, okay? Again, it's just practice. People can get it or not. I found that in the language class course, he mentioned that he got it after the word arroz, which is rice in Spanish. Arroz. There's a double R there. A nice example of the difference is pero, which is but, like, but I want to go home or something, right? But, pero in Spanish. And there's perro, which is a dog, right? Perro. And so perro, perro. Maybe some people can hear that difference. Others really struggle with it. I'll say double R's don't really matter that much. Vowels are 10 times more important. Remember, the previous thing is much more important, okay? Then we have the enye, which is basically an N and a Y put together, right? Think about the country Kenya, right? N-y. There's an N and a Y. That's what that sound is. Very simple. Español. This is the enye. Very, very simple. You shouldn't really struggle with that one. The J's and the G's in Spanish are kind of interesting. So G's in the beginning of words are usually either pronounced like a G, like a G, like in guerra. But over time, they can be pronounced as either a H sound or a H sound in English. The easiest one is the H sound, right? So you have the verb to turn is girar or girar. And that starts with G. And the J sounds are the exact same. They either are pronounced like a H sound or a H sound. And so think about jalapeno or jalapeno, right? It's either H or H. So very simple. Okay, so now that we've gone through the first 3, this last one is kind of interesting, okay? So first it's accent, okay? Accent and stress. Now I'm not talking about like Argentinian accent where it's like me llamo instead of me llamo, or Colombian maybe me llamo, right? That exists, sure. That doesn't really affect pronunciation because you can choose any one of them and they're all correct. When we talk about accent and stress, we're actually talking about this thing that you see in Spanish, which is the tilde. So you know in Spanish sentences, you see this little line at the top that's sort of like on the I's and the O's and the other letters. You'll see this line at the top and this dictates Spanish stress or like accent, okay? So let me show you a visual representation of this, okay? So if we took the word, let's take the verb to present firstly, presentar, okay? In Spanish, there is a difference between saying presentar or presentar. Or for example, I speak in Spanish is hablo, right? Everyone knows that. We have hablo español, right? In Spanish, there's a stress here, okay? And the stress is in the beginning, right? Because there's a difference between hablo and hablo. In English, we don't hear this and we don't even understand this difference, but in Spanish, it's crucial. Hablo, the stress is in the beginning, and sometimes that line won't even be there. It's just automatically sort of said that way. And then hablo shows that stress with the tilde, and you can see how the stress and the accent is on the ending. And hablo means I speak or I'm speaking, but hablo means he spoke or she spoke or it spoke or you formal spoke, right? And so both of these look pretty much the same, but because the stress in this one is in the beginning and the stress in this one is in the end, it changes the meaning. Not just because of that, obviously it's because of conjugation, right? In this conjugation, you take off the R and you put O, right? But the stress goes there. And so the idea here is Spanish has stress. There's a difference in stress, right? You'll see it in words like these, okay? Now, this doesn't matter necessarily much in that. But for example, if I said presento versus presento, then it matters, okay? Some people really struggle with this, and this doesn't matter as much, okay? For example, with Eduardo, for example, a lot of times, for example, he said palabras instead of palabras, okay? The thing is, even though that's technically incorrect, this is kind of like what he said, palabras, which is wrong. It's actually palabras. Even though it's incorrect in the sense of accent, it still doesn't affect it that much. And even some people in Spanish-speaking countries may say it in that sort of way. And so this matters when it comes to verb conjugation, not as much for words themselves, but just understand that there's accent and stress on certain parts of words, okay? And for example, we had if we said hablaría, right? It's not hablaría, but it's hablaría. And the stress is on this ia, right? This part of the word. That's where the stress is. Hablaría, right? Not hablaria. Do you hear that difference? Hablaría, hablaria. Completely different. And in Spanish, people really notice that kind of stuff, okay? And the reason why is because it changes whole meanings. Like, hablo is one thing, hablo is a whole nother thing, okay? And this is why it matters in Spanish, okay? So those are the 4 steps or 3 steps to mastering the Spanish accent. I have more videos like this where I go through sort of different concepts in Spanish. And if you want to finally implement these frameworks and learn Spanish in a clear and structured way, then you can check the description to join my program called the Spanish Academy. It's risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it for 3-4 weeks if you want, and then get a refund on the last day if you're not happy. Otherwise, you can grab my free, easy-to-use Cognate cheat sheet to unlock thousands of words in Spanish, just like that. It's all in the description, and it's no email required. You don't have to opt into an email or anything. You literally just get the cheat sheet where you can unlock 3,000 Spanish words just like that, okay? Otherwise, be sure to subscribe and watch more videos so YouTube can recommend more of these videos to you, which will help you improve more. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and stay humble.